good evening or good morning or whatever time it is, wherever you are. My name is Fred Brown. I'm chair of the Ethics Committee of the Society of Professional Journalists, and I'll be the moderator of the discussion that follows. This webinar was put together by Dan Kubisky, who is behind the scenes, keeping us technologically on track. He is co-chair of SPJ's international community. The international community encourages press freedoms around the world and looks for ways to show the connection between journalists in the United States and elsewhere in other countries. This presentation is an example of that mission. While people are joining us, welcome to those who are already here, but let me just go over a few things about how this is going to run. And excuse me while I refer to my notes. The guests and I will have a conversation. That means while we chat, you can pose questions in the Q&I option on your screen. Q&A, not Q&I. Dan will be using the chat function to post information and websites related to today's discussion. Please submit questions that you may have in the Q&A box. It may be at the top of your screen, the bottom of your screen, but look for the Q&A box, and that's where we will look for questions. The session will be recorded and placed in the international community's YouTube channel, which you'll find directions on how to get to later in the program. SPJ has a code of ethics we hope all journalists use as a guide in their work. Numerous news organizations have their own codes of ethics and standards and practices. Those are enforceable. The SPJ Code of Ethics is more of a voluntary thing, but we think the guidance there is pretty broadly accepted in the industry. This, by the way, is Sunshine Week, and in which SPJ and other journalism organizations promote access to public information. And the event tonight could actually be considered sort of a precursor to another major event that SPJ does annually, Ethics Week, which this year will be April 14th through 20th. In this diverse world, there's always the possibility of differences in how standards and ethics are applied. With us today are three editors who have had experience and in looking at and having some control over standards and practices from a larger perspective. Kathy English was the longest serving standards and practices editor for the Toronto Star and is now the president of the Canadian Journalism Foundation. Stephen Springer is the standards and practices editor for Radio Free Europe and formerly held the same position for Voice of America. And Eric Wishart is the standards and practices editor of Agence France Presse. Eric is based in Hong Kong, although today's in the Philippines with Roosters and Karaoke. And he's also the former editor-in-chief of AFP and a valued member of the SPJ Ethics Committee. So, do we have any questions? Well, not yet. So Eric actually has a presentation that would be a good way, I think, to kick off this discussion. So I will turn it over to Eric, and then the rest of us can talk about what he's about to show us. So Eric, it's over to you.
Thanks, Fred, and hello, everybody. Thanks for inviting me. Yeah, I'm actually based in Paris, but I work out of Hong Kong. So I just wanted to start the discussion by just showing you some of the sort of experience we've had with the war, the Israel-Hamas war, and the whole situation in Israel and Gaza. And I mean, I think conflicts like this really expose the fault lines in journalism and also have the most ethical challenges for journalists. And this has been exceptional. I've got a close colleague in another major news organization who said that she'd never seen such a divisive discussion within the newsroom. It's been a very divisive topic in newsrooms. So I just wanted to just share for 5 minutes some of our experiences. And I would say also how it applies to the SPJ code as well, and some of the rules we have in it. So I would say that you can see the screen, yes?
Yes.
Yeah.
I can see it, yes.
Yeah, okay. So I think one thing that really should be highlighted and isn't, I mean, I wrote the ethics code for AFP in 2015, 2016. So I think I read every single ethics code I could find. And I think one thing that's not as highlighted as it should be is the responsibility of media organizations when it comes to safety of their staff and freelancers. And this has been absolutely front and foremost in the coverage of Israel, Gaza, and the West Bank. This is a photograph on the very first day near a kibbutz. Journalists went down. You'll see they already have the correct gear on them. These was Israeli soldiers literally in the process of fighting Hamas, getting them out of Israel. So I think it's important to cannot overestimate not only the importance of safety in journalism, but the ethical responsibility towards your staff and towards each other. If you go into a dangerous situation, you should be equipped to give first aid to your colleagues. So that's a big topic for me when it comes to ethics. You can see the physical dangers there, obviously, which then were obviously replicated in both Gaza and the West Bank as the conflicts escalated. Don't underestimate, of course, the psychological effects. Our Israeli or Palestinian colleagues all seeing loved ones killed, being directly targeted themselves. So we have online counselling available. We're very aware of the problems of PTSD at AFP. So it's not just the physical dangers. And when I was editor-in-chief around the time of the war in Afghanistan and Iraq with my team, we introduced mandatory hostile environment training for journalists going into danger zones. And I think Fred or Dan referenced a previous talk I gave, and I was quite struck on January the 6th, Washington, how many journalists in America don't have the proper gear going into a situation like that. So I don't know what the forthcoming election period is going to bring, but I really urge newsrooms and journalists to really get training, get the gear, because you can be in the smallest town anywhere and be confronted with a dangerous situation. So safety first. Some things you can't legislate against. There was a strike in our office. The big hole used to be the AFP office in Gaza. The Israelis said it wasn't targeted, but they were firing in the area. So something hit us. So, physical dangers in Israel, physical dangers in Gaza. Very early in the war in South Lebanon, there was a group of journalists, Al Jazeera, Reuters, AP, and AFP, right on the border looking over into Israel, and there was a strike on them. Reuters journalist was killed. Several others were wounded, including an AFP journalist who had her right leg amputated, Unusually, and again, I think responsibility of media to investigate. When something happens to one of your staff, we have a right to know what happened. The Israelis said they were investigating it. We're still waiting, but both Reuters and AFP brought in independent experts, ballistics experts, arms experts, to find out what happened. And the consensus was there were the remnants of Israeli tank shells. So for whatever reason, these journalists were hit, and AFP also came to the same conclusion. And I'd be quite happy if anybody wants, I'd be quite happy to share the details of that investigation. So again, an ethical responsibility, not only to protect your journalist, but when something goes wrong, to find out what happened. Very divisive. This was a story in Al Jazeera. There's been divisions. This was a story, I'm not talking about other media, but just quoting press reports, BBC journalists accused broadcaster of bias, but BBC journalists say the cooperation is failing to humanize Palestinians. This was earlier in the conflict. Similar at CNN. So it's been a big topic in newsrooms internationally, not just in the US. This was a discussion I got involved in. John Simpson, veteran journalist that I met once, wrote about why the BBC doesn't call Hamas terrorists and got vilified on social media, a lot of criticism. And at AFP, we have the same rule as AP, Reuters, and other big media organizations, that we don't call Hamas or anybody else terrorists as a news agency. Le Figaro, which is a conservative newspaper, France, wrote this story, wrote a couple of stories about it. Le Figaro headline, controversy, AFP bans the term terrorist to describe Hamas. Okay, so I was, on the strength of this blowback in France, I was asked to write this piece about why we don't, or how we use the word terrorist. I mean, our thinking about it is we're not, I think one important thing, and I think there's the problem when it came to the BBC and other news outlets, is this was not a rule made for Hamas, okay? This is something that we and other news organizations have long applied to the IRA, the FARC, you name it. So it's, we're not in the big business as a news agency providing content to many hundreds or thousands of media journalists around the world. We're not in the business of attaching labels to things. We give the facts and let people decide. We will say that Hamas is designated as a terrorist organization by the US, by Israel, by the European Union. But we don't put that label on it any more than we put the label on a politician who will fact check a politician, but we won't call them a liar. We'll describe what a leader, a president of a country does. We won't call them a dictator. So this, I think there was a bit of misrepresentation that news agencies had suddenly decided not to call Hamas terrorists. This is a long-standing rule, and we applied it when our journalists were killed in Afghanistan. Journalists I knew closely, Afghan journalists, were murdered. We didn't call the people who did it terrorists. So this is a rule we also apply when it happens to ourselves. I won't go on too long. I just want to finish by saying it's a very difficult conflict. Cover conflicting versions from both sides. I think the attack on this, the strike on this hospital was quite problematic. First of all, Hamas accused the Israelis of striking it, and the Israelis said it was a rocket that went astray fired by Islamic Jihad, not Hamas. So initial reports said it was an Israeli air raid. That was Al Jazeera, but other other media organizations outside of the region led with that too. Okay, the fact that the Israelis had struck the hospital. AP story, later story, was much more balanced, which I think was the correct approach. Trade blame. So, I mean, it's just some basic journalistic rules we applied, and we've updated our internal guidelines on covering the Middle East. I recently did a major overhaul of our Middle East guidelines, and we've added a separate section on uncovering the war in the Middle East, the importance of language, but also the importance of basic news reporting. And I think this came up again last week when there was the more than 100 people killed when the aid convoy, there was just this mess. There was a stampede, Israeli soldiers shot, lorries ran over people. So I think a very basic rule, begin with the source. Don't say X struck Y, Hamas or Israel said. Begin with the source if you don't know. Immediately that puts a bit of distance when you cannot independently verify a piece of information or check it with a second source, particularly from alerts and headlines, okay? And I think you have to be really transparent as a journalist. People know you can't be everywhere. So what we say is if there are contradictory versions of doubtful casualty figures, be transparent. Explain if you were present at the scene or not, and that you could not provide independent verification. And I think if you follow these rules, you can do your best to give a fairly balanced and at least impartial view of what happened, and then let your readers decide. So that was just a little introduction from me.
Thank you, Eric. We had a question that came in through the chat. And by the way, the question should go to the Q&A box. But essentially it is, when Charlie Hebdo, the magazine, was attacked, was there as much concern about using the word terrorist then, or has this been more or less a recent development? And also, is there as much concern about using the term terrorism for the act as there is about using the word terrorist for the person? So,
I mean, that's a good question. The first question, actually, this came up. This must be a new rule. Okay, did AFP just create this rule for Hamas? Is this a recent thing? And I actually went back into my files, which I've kept on hard disks. I actually found when I was editor-in-chief around 2000, no, it must have been around 2000, around 9/11 time, already writing a rule of not using, labeling people as terrorists. On the second question, we will talk about terrorism as a phenomenon politically, or other, political violence against innocent civilians. So we don't ban the use of the word. We will talk about people arrested on terrorism charges. So we don't ban the discussion, of course, about it, or the use of the terms, or in quotes, but it's just the labeling of individuals or groups as terrorists ourselves that we don't do. But as I say, we will say that Hamas is designated as terrorist by X, Y, Z.
Yeah. How about the other members of the panel? Do you have any official positions on use for terror or terrorism, terrorist?
Well, it's essentially at Radio Free Asia, it is essentially the same as what Eric's talking about at AFP. We will not specifically, as a news organization, label any particular person or group or activity as a terrorist or a terrorist group. We will only do it with attribution. When someone else lays that on that particular group, we will attribute it properly. And just to address Robert Buckman's question, if Hamas doesn't fit AFP's concept of terrorists, again, I think that the key here is not what any news organization thinks what a group or an individual or the act might be. That's not our job. Our job is to report that it happened and to report how other parties involved are terming this. It gets into a very slippery slope if any news organization starts to put these kind of labels on individuals, because at that point, we run the risk of looking as if, for lack of a better term, that a news organization, any news organization, is quote unquote taking sides. And I think that's something that we all have to be very aware of. So, I mean, I had the question, even though Radio Free Asia, what is going on between Israel and Hamas is not, top of the ledger for us. It still engendered a conversation because we still had to cover the story in some way. And so, yes, it meant meeting with staff and sending emails and explaining all of this. And it was generally accepted. And we've gone forward from there without any problems.
The Toronto Star had pretty well the same language, the same concept for sure. And as the public editor, it was my role to explain the standards and practices to the public. And I think I wrote a column on that issue in 2019 about why the Toronto Star does not label anyone as terrorists. It is a hard one for the public to understand, and particularly as value judgments come up. But I would argue that what's going on in the Middle East now, all of the journalistic standards and practices that are at play here are the reason why we have standards and ethics, because we can't make it up as we go along. One of the most important things that we do in our roles and that we ask of newsroom journalists is to be consistent. So if it was just left to us, like, oh yeah, that was really, really horrendous, so we're going to call them terrorists. We just can't make it up as we go along. We need to have some guidelines, some rules we work within, and ultimately we need to be able to explain them. We need to be able to explain, as both Eric and Stephen, you have done so well here.
Another thing I'd like to say on this, there was a bit of a discussion at RFA with some outside observers. And one of the individuals, and I was part of the discussion with our executive editor, and one of the individuals said, well, we know they're terrorists. And my answer was, we don't know anything. We're reporting what we see. We're reporting what we're finding out. And then I said, and I don't mean to possibly offend anybody, but if you look at this in a broader view, when someone says, we know they're terrorists, well, think about the view of the Palestinians. I'm not talking about Hamas. Think of the view of the Palestinians. They know that Israel has been an oppressor for decades. Because they know that, is it then our responsibility to put that term on Israel because they know? That's getting very dangerous. And that's why, when someone says, oh, well, we know they're terrorists. No, we have to report what others are seeing and hearing about it, rather than us, like Kathy just said, making those value judgments and just randomly throwing those words out there. There has to be a discussion. There has to be an understanding about where we're coming from when we're doing this and why we're doing it this way.
And Kathy,
Fred, can I ask Kathy a question?
Sure.
I mean, Kathy, you were dealing with the public. I mean, one thing that strikes me about this whole discussion is why the obsession with the word terrorist. I mean, AFP, we described it, graphic detail. We published horrendous photographs, and I saw the incoming from Israel. It wasn't seen by the public. Horrendous. We did not hold back in that coverage of saying what Hamas did to these people. Why is terror? What feedback did you get from the public? Why is terrorism? Why is the use of the word terrorism such a point of discussion? Why the obsession with it?
It's such a great question, Eric. I think that there's so much emotion involved. I think when I wrote the column, it was around the that horrible shooting in New Zealand, and then there became an international discussion on that, or whether that was a terrorist. And I think even there was discussion, was it even terrorism? It went further than that. I think that people want certainty, and there's emotions involved. They want certainty. They want to think that news organizations will tell them like it is, and they don't. The nuances that we think about and talk about all the time around what is a fact. Is that a fact, or is that an opinion? That is something I probably wrote 5 columns a year on the difference between fact and opinion on news and opinion journalism, and it to me, it's one of the biggest misunderstandings within the public. So this kind of fits a little bit into that issue.
Kathy, that's a good point. I think the more we can explain why we do what we do, the better it is. And as a former columnist myself, I was also a reporter at the time I was writing columns, so it was a little more difficult for me. But should there be a difference, do you think, in the standards that an editorial or opinion writer follows than a regular reporter follows? Or should these rules be organization-wide?
So, we had a glossary on the homepage that explained what, and we labeled all our content too as either news or opinion. And this was aligned with being part of the Trust Project, which asked news organizations to label their content. And the way we explained it to people is that news is factual. It has to be evidence-based. It answers the question, how do you know what you state as fact? Opinions are based on the facts, but by nature, opinions are not fair because they take some opinion or some facts and marshal them to create an argument. That really doesn't fall into the fairness principles. And trying to explain that to our audiences, I think is really challenging. And it's even more challenging in a world where everybody watches cable news that is, 24/7, largely opinions, a lot of talking heads, expressing opinions, and the public thinks that is the news. And I feel like that's really dangerous. People not understanding the principles that are the foundation of news reporting and news gathering.
Have any of you noticed a generational shift, perhaps, in that younger reporters, younger journalists are looking for more of an opportunity to express themselves than they feel that traditional journalism gives them? I noticed that. I taught media ethics for 15 years at the University of Denver. And at the beginning, the journalism students were pretty traditional. But by the end of my teaching tenure there, I found there was more of a wish to participate and not just observe.
I certainly saw that as well. And I think this has been an issue that's been roiling newsrooms for the last 4 to 5 years. It really is around advocacy, journalism as advocacy. And I know a lot of newsrooms are really struggling with this around the Middle East right now because there's so much dissension within their own newsrooms, not only with audiences.
I think, Fred, speaking to, again, the younger audience, I think the fact that they've now come up in an environment where you can put your point of view out there as fast as that, whereas for those of us who are a little bit older, it used to be the only way you can get your point of view out there was if you hopefully got a letter to the editor published.
Mm-hmm.
There was no immediate outlet, and I think that's a big part of it, the immediacy to be able to feel whatever it is you're feeling, even if you are working in news, and to be able to just bang on your keyboard and hit enter, and there it is for everyone to see. And I think there's that sort of internal editor that is missing. That, again, those of us who've been working at this for a while, we have that. I've even talked to our own staff, and I've talked to college students about this. There have been times over the years I see something on Twitter or Facebook, and I'm just going away at the keyboard, and then my hand is poised in the air, and I read it, and then I delete it, because I know what's going to happen if I hit enter, and just by typing it, I've gotten it out of me, and I don't want to go. I don't want to get to the next step where everyone's going to start jumping on me, and I try to explain it to everyone. This is one of the things about being a journalist. Once we decide this is our profession, regardless of whether it's behind the scenes, in front of the camera, whether you have a byline, we do give up a certain measure of privacy once we start working in one of the most public businesses that there can be. And I think that's the other thing that the younger generation coming up doesn't understand. I shouldn't say understand, but doesn't see it the way we see it.
Yeah,
because we came up in a different age.
Yes, that's true. You also give up a certain First Amendment rights.
Yes.
Too. I mean, I would never think of running for office, for example, but I think, or putting a sign in your yard. There are a lot of news organizations that say you can't even do that. And do you remember the controversy that the NPR sort of walked into when it changed its policy about participating in demonstrations? I've looked at their policy, and it's not really as liberal, if you will, as its critics have said it is, it still requires a certain amount of oversight by management and approval.
I mean, I would just say, I still think the most powerful way of advocating for anything is the facts.
I
Yeah.
agree.
Just-
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I live in Hong Kong, which has been transformed in the last 2, 3, 4 years. And I'm quite active on, well, I was on X, more on LinkedIn quite a lot these days, still residually on Facebook. And all I do is post what the government or others say and leave it up to people to decide. I don't need to add another layer. I don't need to have to add another layer about the evidence against the Apple daily publisher, Jimmy Lai, on trial, what he's accused of, what people are saying. Just quote it, just give the facts. People will make up their own minds, one way or the other. But I think that it's counterproductive to add on a line saying, yeah, well, they said this, or this guy did this. But I think it's just, people will draw their own conclusions. So I think the strongest argument for anything is the facts.
I agree. And journalism itself, factual journalism itself, is a strong form of advocacy in advocating for truth. And Fred, I think that the SPJ Code of Ethics value the act independently. We have to keep coming back to that we're there to act independently, not for a certain point of view, not for a certain side, not for a certain outcome. That is not the job of journalism. But I do believe that is being questioned by a new generation of journalists. And I've seen that both in the newsroom and in the classrooms that I've taught in as well over the last few years.
Yes. Speaking of that, how do you use your code of ethics, your standards and principles? Do the people who work at your organization, or in Kathy's case, in Canada generally now, that and previously in Toronto, are employees asked to review these principles, to sign anything, to promise to adhere, to sacrifice a chicken or other small animal?
Well, I'll answer for the STAR. Whenever we had new interns come in, I would do training sessions on it to make sure that they were, that they knew what was in it, that they knew what standards they were being held to. We never got to the point of asking anyone to sign that. I think everybody liked to think other people took it as seriously as it had always been taken within the newsroom. But I think that as the public editor, I use that code of ethics as my basis for judging public complaints. So complaints would come to me, and I would tell the public. First of all, the whole standards manual is online, in public. Everyone can see it.
I was going to ask.
I wrote about it constantly. I pointed readers to it constantly. So, I mean, that gives readers who want to weaponize your journalism in some way, that gives them a lot of ammunition to come and say, well, your code of ethics says this, but reporter X did this. It was my job to adjudicate that complaint against the standards and try and find the place of, did the reporter, did the newsroom somehow contravene the ethics, and if so, why? And where's the lapse between the ideal and the reality? Explaining that. But I think that our newsroom knew that because the public editor position there has existed since 1972, it started out as the ombudsman role. Our newsroom knew how seriously those standards are taken, and that the public editor will always be looking at them to assess a complaint.
In the case of Radio Free Asia, when I got there last year, there's an existing conflict of interest policy by itself, and there was code of journalistic ethics by itself, but there was no one repository where you could find everything that has to do with new standards and best practices. So having put together a standard guide when I was at VOA, I basically used that as my template to create a standards guide for Radio Free Asia that incorporated the existing policies, but then added more meat, more explanation about these policies. And what I did was, after it was published, I published it in November of last year. I met with every one of our language services and every one of our other groups, our creative group, our investigative group. I asked them all to read it. I gave them a couple of weeks to do that, and then basically said, come at me with any questions that you have. I don't want to just sit there and go through page 30 and talk about page 27 and then 56. You tell me what's in this guide that you have questions about. And it turned into about a dozen really good conversations, because I raised things in the guide that they, again, never really understood, never knew, and never knew that it was something to be concerned about in doing journalism. So as a result of that, I get, your usual diet of emails during the week. Steve, can we say this? Can we show this? If we can, how? And I always make sure that if I say this isn't going to work, here's why.
Yeah.
Because I think the most important thing again, for any standards editor, as you were saying, Kathy, on explaining it to the public, it's equally important to explain it to the staff, not just say you can't,
yes.
but here's why. And I find that they're most appreciative of that it's not just coming down from on high on a tablet. It's here's everything you need to know about why I'm telling you this. So I think that's really important.
I agree.
And the AFP, we're constantly talking about standards, ethics, style, for example, and I work closely with a journalist called Jessica Lopez, who is the agency's first diversity editor. So we were constantly updating the guidelines, and for example, we have quite a regular style newsletter that we put out, which incorporates style updates and also ethical updates. We recently published a list, guidelines on diversity and coverage, because I think 25% of voices in an analysis pieces and other coverage are women, 75% are still men, many media. So we're working on building up the number of non-male voices in our coverage. And we publish guidelines on how to do it, right? We don't want to see only 3 male analysts or 4 male analysts in a story. Also with a list of websites or links or sites where you can find women analysts on experts on specific topics. So we're very active on that. The war in Ukraine, I updated and then shared to the agency our rules on covering prisoners of war, something people generally don't understand. Graphic imagery, the use of the word refugee, another one that people don't understand. So we're quite proactive and reactive, if that's the right word. If something comes up that's new, we'll write a new set of guidelines and share it. If it's something that exists but suddenly comes into the news, like writing about refugees or covering prisoners of war, we will just redistribute it, add and share the link to the ethics code. So the editor-in-chief in Paris issues a daily editorial note after the morning conference, which I attend afternoon time in Asia, constantly pointing out, style, we're updating this. Airdrop, which come up this week. Airdrop is 1 word, not 2 words. At AFP, I think the same elsewhere. So it can be the micro and the macro. And, ethics codes, as you know, are not things you update regularly, but the first major update we did was last year, actually. We added an entry, a section in the ethics code about how to use artificial intelligence at AFP.
That's good.
So you've got to keep it updated. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it needs to be a living document, and understanding that things evolve. I led the process of updating the Toronto Star's manual twice over 13 years. What worked there was also a lot of newsroom consultation. So we had committees that were looking at various areas. And, one of the most controversial things for journalists a decade ago was the social media policy. So we made sure that there was a committee of newsroom journalists who drafted the first one, who worked with senior editors and with lawyers, and so that we got that type of buy-in and cooperation by involving people, because it affects everyone in the newsroom.
We have had a lot of discussions about amending the SPJ Code of Ethics over the years. And one of the things we tried to do with the last update in 2013, 2014 was to remove any reference to any specific technology and just concentrate on principles, and hoping that that would mean that we wouldn't have to revise the code every time a new technology emerged. And I think it's so far it's worked, but I'm not so sure we can hold back AI all that well. It seems to be a very powerful technology that and for that reason a bigger threat. I was going to mention that SPJ has been concerned about diversity for a very long time, and in fact, one of the first efforts we had to encourage a broader use of sources was a thing called the Rainbow Rolodex. Mm-hmm. So that gives you an idea how old that campaign was. But at the time, well, I was still a working reporter, one of my favorite sources was a scientist, a geophysicist who studied earthquakes around the world. And he had an office full of seismographs and read outputs, and he was quoted frequently. And he was African American. He was Black, but even better than that, his name, for this guy who looked at squiggly lines all day, was Waverly Person. And I thought, what a perfect name. So I quoted him a lot, even though I wasn't writing science. Eric, can you tell us a little bit, what's it like working in Hong Kong with, now that the Chinese are more assertive than they were, say, 20 years ago?
Well, I don't think it's a question of the Chinese. I think it's a question of the national security law, which was brought in after the 2019 protests. And in the wake of that, they've been very liberal in their use of the sedition law, which goes back to the colonial era, and also arresting people on national security charges, particularly the famous case being Jimmy Lai, who's the publisher and owner of the Apple Daily. They've now resurrected this old legislation, which we call Article 23, which is a further layer of national security legislation. I would say for international media, we're studying the new legislation to see what it means. I think the situation has generally remained the same. They've gone, the people who seem to have been the most targeted, if that's the right word, were local media, for sure. Media that advocated, for example, what they call foreign external interference, who advocated independence for Hong Kong. Basically any, but they've introduced this other concept, this new government. The chief executive of Hong Kong is a former policeman called John Lee, and the security secretary is a former policeman called Chris Tang, who are both quite vocal about national security. It's what they call soft resistance. Soft resistance. That means, what does that mean? It means, complaining about something, saying, criticizing the government. They say it's stirring up hate against the government. So it's quite, the political discussion in Hong Kong is quite problematic. For journalists, I think the main concern is sometimes journalists or others get refused entry to Hong Kong. Some photographers who covered the protests who arrived in Hong Kong get turned back. Also, I think the director of Human Rights Watch didn't get let in. So I think you can still report freely, but they really went after opinion, anything they thought was stirring up trouble. But it's a very, particularly for local media, it's been very tough. They're in jail, and one issue in Hong Kong, generally, if you're arrested under national security legislation, you're not released on bail, so you can spend a long time in jail before you come to trial. And I know about half a dozen people in jail, including a former AFP journalist, Claudia Moe, who became a pro-democracy politician who's been in jail for 3 years now.
Just as a general question, are there? I know there are accreditation systems and even licensing systems in various places around the world. Is that something you think is that a threat, or is it something that maybe some version of needs to be applied to people calling themselves journalists in the free-for-all of the American journalism system?
I think that it's a loaded question. And I think for years, journalists have said, anybody's free to be a journalism. Freedom of expression means anyone can seek information, anyone can communicate information. I wonder now if, because we're living in a world where everyone has a megaphone, a platform, whether we need to do more to make clear not who is a journalism, but what is an act of journalism, and what are the standards and the practices that mean that something is journalism. That there's a lot of noise out there, but all the noise, all information is not journalism. So how do you differentiate journalism as a practice? And I won't go so far to say as a profession, but what is journalism? And I think we can expect people who do journalism to uphold the kind of standards that the SPJ has long espoused.
Steve, thoughts?
Well, anybody, following off from what Kathy was just saying, anybody can observe something happening and say, this happened, I saw it, he attacked him, they did this, they did that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Anybody can do that. But if you're not asking, why were these two guys in combat? What happened? What preceded this? Who has a grudge against who? What's the background? Why? That's the thing, the why of it, not the it happened. Why did it happen? The context, the background. That's what makes just reporting pure facts different from reporting a full story that gives your audience a better understanding of that particular event. So I think that's to me the basic and most important difference, the context, the why of something that has occurred.
The analysis, verging a little bit on opinion, but probably analysis is in that area between just stenography and voicing, coming up with answers to problems, or
I don't even know if it's a question of coming up with answers. It's just being able to give your audience a better understanding of what precipitated this, that it didn't just happen out of nowhere and, oh, here's two guys doing this, or here's two sides fighting. Why? Just give me the background. Tell me what led to this. I don't think that necessarily has to get into opinion. It's still putting facts out there for people to be able to judge for themselves. And again, I think that's the most important thing. It's not up to us to judge what we're seeing. It's up to us to provide them that information, let them make up their own minds about what we're telling them about and what background we're giving them.
And it's also, I think, our obligation to follow up, to see what happened. Is anything being done to change the situation that was a problem? And that's one area where I think journalists need to devote a lot more attention. Eric, do you have more thoughts on that?
I mean, it was very relevant in Hong Kong during the protests because a lot of young people covered it. And I, as I think I was vice president of the Foreign Correspondents Club in Hong Kong at the time, had 2 meetings with the Hong Kong police at their headquarters in Wan Chai. And I told them that they wouldn't recognize these young people as journalists. And I basically said, well, it's not up to the police to tell journalists who are journalists any more than it's me to tell you your job. And they are doing acts of journalism. I call them amateur journalism. I'm not a great fan of citizens journalism. I think amateur journalism was good. these young people with their mobile phones played an essential role in the coverage of the protests. They were eyes and ears on the ground. I told the police that actually the very first time a policeman shot a protester, it was all filmed by a student journalist and actually showed what happened and took away any doubt in the discussion about who was to blame or who wasn't. So I said it's also in your interest that people can see. But I came up against a brick wall, and I think it was the Hong Kong Journalists Association represents journalists in Hong Kong, both local journalists and international journalists, and was excluded from a discussion. The government had a discussion with media, which I wasn't involved in Hong Kong, about, I think it was about Article 23, and they excluded the Hong Kong Journalists Association. It's an advocacy group, and also they defended a journalist. They said a journalist who was 13, a 13-year-old was a journalist, and how can a 13? I wrote School News when I was 13. I don't think there's an age limit. So to cut along, to give a short answer, I think going out in that context, acts of journalism, yeah, they were amateur journalists, and I think it was generally, we verified it, we used it. I think it was generally accurate. It was honest. They weren't faking it. There was a lot of rumors and disinformation from all sides during that. But I'm very much an advocate of. I'm quite liberal, let's put it that way, when it comes to someone. As long as they respect the basic rules, and I say, right, read the SBJ Code of Conduct if you can go and do Code of Ethics.
All right.
It's not just
are they
random.
accountable? Are they accountable if they make a mistake? Will they correct it? Will they tell the audience that they made a mistake?
I think accountability is one of the most important principles in any code of ethics. And speaking of which, we've pretty much come close to the end of the hour, and there's a tradition to end these discussions of the international community by asking each of you this question. And I think I will start with Steve, because we sort of, well, you've been the middleman here on my screen. And the question is, what does press freedom mean to you?
To me, press freedom, and again, I preface this with having worked for two organizations where we go into countries that don't necessarily have press freedom. Press freedom to me means the ability to be able to report from wherever you are, whether it's here in the US or in Asia or in Africa, wherever it is, to be able to report the news honestly, consistently, factually, and responsibly. That's the trust that the audience is putting in us. And so it's up to us to be able to do that. And by doing so, again, especially in the countries we go into where there's not a free press, we're able to show people what an open, free press is able to accomplish. So that's what press freedom means to me in the places where I've worked. And
it would be a good banner to put up in every newsroom. Kathy, what does press, freedom
my
mean
context is, I work in a country that, and have worked most of my life in a country that has relative press freedom. I see the reports every year on International Press Freedom Day, and, see where Canada stands. I also did a fellowship at the Reuters Institute with journalists from around the world, so really got a sense of what it's like, for my colleague in Pakistan, not to have the press freedom that I have enjoyed for years. But to me, it comes down to, that first value of the SPJ code. It's the freedom to seek truth and report it. It's also the courage to seek truth and report it independently, without fear of failure. And that means not censorship from a government, from a business, from a platform, from power, or from oneself. So that being free and having courage to report the truth and follow it wherever it takes you.
Thank you. And Eric, you began this discussion, and maybe it's.
I mean, Fred, you told us you were going to ask that question, so I thought about it, and I would say that press freedom is something that is extremely precious and should not be taken for granted. I mean, I work for a news organization with offices from the most free societies to the most authoritarian, That's one thing, and that's a fact that has long existed, and you work within the limits of whatever system you're in to get the truth and facts out. What I experienced in Hong Kong, which is why I say it's something that shouldn't be taken for granted, is in the last few years, is how a society can be transformed from where there was pretty much unlimited press freedom within the laws of libel or defamation or whatever in Hong Kong, to a society where journalists are chilled, self-censor, jailed. People I know Jimmy Lang personally, he's in jail, he's been in jail for years and may never get out. So all I would say is press freedom is precious, but don't take it for granted anywhere, United States or anywhere. So that's what I would say about press freedom.
Yes, that's a good point. I think we have seen in the United States that we've taken it for granted, and maybe we shouldn't here as well. Well, thanks to our guests and to those of you who are out there listening. I think this has been an interesting and lively discussion. And thanks to you, Steve and Eric and Kathy, for participating. And let me just remind everyone that the international community sponsors events like this on a fairly regular basis, including interviews with journalists and press freedom advocates from around the world. To keep up to date with activities, you can go to the sign up for the IC International Community short weekly newsletter. Dan is putting the link to sign up in the chat box, and also you will find past programs at the International Community YouTube channel, which will be in the chat box too, I believe, if it's not there already. And don't forget to take a look also at some of the other programs that are coming up, including Ethics Week in April, the 14th through the 20th. We have some interesting programs lined up for that too. So thank you all, and good night, good morning, or wherever you are.
Thank you. Thank you for
Thank you,
inviting me.
everyone.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank
Bye.
you. Good to see you.